Part 1, where my journey began. Hello and welcome. Before we begin this journey together, I want to share my story so you can understand who I am, what shaped me, and why I created echoes of the future. I grew up in a diplomatic family. My mother was a diplomat, which meant we traveled to different countries. While she represented the government, we might spend 4 years in one country, 1 year in another, and then move again. I have lived in 4 countries and experienced many different cultures. Until recently, I had never lived anywhere for longer than 6 years. Melbourne is now the longest place I have ever called home. When I was 3 years old, I lived in Belgium. When I was 8, I moved to Australia. Later, my mother met and married my stepfather, who was British. She decided to leave the diplomatic corps and begin a new life with him in England. My 2 brothers and my sister stayed behind, so I was the only child who traveled with my mother into this new family situation. We moved to Reading, near London. I had to adjust to another country, another culture, and another school system. I went from private education to a public school, and because the school years were different between Australia and the United Kingdom, I also started late. I was entering my teenage years, separated from my siblings, and trying to understand my place in a new home. There were also differences in our spiritual beliefs. I was raised Roman Catholic and believed strongly in God, while my stepfather did not share those beliefs. Home became emotionally difficult, and I often felt misunderstood. School brought its own challenges, but it also gave me something that would remain with me for the rest of my life: music. One of my first friends saw me in the school corridor and invited me to join a talent competition. She wanted us to perform as Destiny's Child. She was Beyoncé, I was Kelly, and we found a third member. From that moment, music became my safe place. I took part in musicals, performing arts, and school activities. I started my own girl group. My friends, my school, and my creative pursuits gave me a sense of belonging when everything else felt uncertain. But the conflict at home continued. At around 14, I began running away. Sometimes things would be resolved, and I would return home, but the same problems would begin again. Despite that instability, I continued my education and completed my GCSEs. By 16, I was working at a stadium ticket office. I saved my money and managed to get my own apartment. For the first time, I felt independent, and I believed I was beginning to build a life of my own. My mother told me how proud everyone was of me. She then offered me what I believed was a holiday. I was planning to visit family in Africa, and she asked whether I wanted to travel through America or Australia. I chose Australia because my brothers and sister were there. However, when I arrived, I discovered that my ticket was one way. My passport and phone were taken, and I was told that I would be staying in Australia to finish school. Once again, my life had changed without my control. I negotiated with my family. I agreed to finish school in Australia, but I made it clear that when I turned 18, I wanted to return to London and study psychology. Because my GCSE grades were strong, I completed what should have been 2 years of A-level study in only 1 year. I thought I was getting closer to my plan. Then, in one moment, everything changed. Part 2, the accident and rebuilding my life. During a New Year's trip to Canberra, I was involved in a serious accident. I was pushed from a moving taxi. While it was making a turn, I fell backwards, fractured my skull, and was dragged along the road. A woman driving behind the taxi stopped and called the police. At first, I was speaking, but I was not making sense. When blood began coming from my ears, the seriousness of my injury became clear. I was rushed to hospital with a traumatic brain injury. Doctors placed me into an induced coma and performed emergency procedures to relieve the pressure and bleeding inside my skull. When I first woke up, I was confused and tried to leave the hospital, so I was sedated again. Altogether, I spent around 2 weeks in a coma. When I eventually woke up properly, I saw my mother sitting beside my bed. I could not understand how she was there because, in my mind, she was still in the United Kingdom. I had no memory of the accident. I was eventually told what had happened, but I wanted to return to normal as quickly as possible. I tried to leave the hospital, return to Melbourne, celebrate my birthday, and go back to school. I was trying to be strong, but I did not yet understand that I had become a different person. It felt as though my whole system had been rewritten. I experienced intense anxiety and short-term memory loss. I would forget conversations and repeat the same stories to people without realizing I had already told them. Being around others became overwhelming. I struggled to continue school. I could no longer work consistently, and I lost my apartment because I could not maintain the income needed to pay for it. I moved in with my brothers, and my mother remained in Australia for around 6 months while we tried to understand what support I needed. There were appointments, legal matters, and a compensation case connected to the accident. Eventually, after another difficult family conflict, I decided I needed space. My mother booked me a trip to the Gold Coast. When I arrived, I could not believe how beautiful and peaceful it felt. The sun was shining. I did not know anyone, and nobody there knew my history. For the first time in a long time, I felt free from other people's expectations. I decided not to return to Melbourne. I found work and stayed in hotels while trying to establish myself. Eventually, I moved into an unfurnished 2-bedroom apartment on Chevron Island. At first, I had almost nothing. I bought a mattress, then a radio and CD player, because music was still one of the most important things in my life. For months, my world consisted mainly of music, work, and sleep. But in that quiet space, I began rebuilding, not all at once, one small step at a time. Part 3. The books, beliefs, and tools that helped me. During this period, I walked past a crystal shop and decided to go inside. I was fascinated by the gemstones and jewelry, but I also noticed a book called The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. At the time, I knew very little about the law of attraction, affirmations, visualization, or this kind of personal development teaching. I bought the book, along with a meditation connected to it, and read it from beginning to end in about 2 days. One idea affected me deeply: the possibility that I could become more intentional about what I focused on and how I responded to life. Until then, I believed anger and fear were simply permanent parts of who I was. I carried anger about my family, my accident, injustice, religion, conflict, and many things happening in the world. The book encouraged me to question whether I had to remain mentally trapped inside those feelings. I began learning to redirect my attention towards the life I wanted to build. For me, this was not about pretending that difficult things had never happened. It was about deciding that those experiences would not be the only things controlling my future. Because of my memory problems, I placed sticky notes around my home. They contained reminders, goals, and affirmations. I wrote statements such as, "Money comes to me easily and frequently. Things happen for me with ease. I can create the life, relationships, and career that I desire. I repeated these words every day, not because everything changed instantly, but because repetition helped me remember what I was choosing to believe. The notes gave my mind direction. I also began limiting the media I consumed. News and television could leave me feeling anxious, powerless, or emotionally overwhelmed, so I became more conscious of what I allowed into my mind. Over time, I moved from feeling deeply lonely to learning how to enjoy my own company. My isolation became a place where I could study, reflect, practice music, record my voice, and imagine a different future. I also continued my formal education. I completed a year of a Bachelor of Applied Social Science because I wanted to understand human behavior, communication, counseling, relationships, and the systems of support that professionals had been recommending to me. I had originally wanted to study psychology, but my experiences showed me that I was more interested in conversation, human connection, and helping people understand themselves. I wanted to educate myself so that I could better understand what I was going through. Books, study, music, faith, affirmations, and self-reflection became some of the tools I used during my recovery. They did not erase what had happened to me, but they helped me begin creating a plan for what could happen next. Part 4. It was about creating an ecosystem in which artists could collaborate, learn, and grow together. Over time, I moved from basic online promotion into social media strategy and digital marketing. Around 2017, I made the decision to study these areas more seriously so I could turn the skills I had developed through experience into a sustainable business. Because of my anxiety and the effects of my brain injury, I could not always imagine myself working in a traditional corporate environment. Digital work gave me another option. It allowed me to use my creativity, communicate globally, continue learning, and build opportunities from home without originally planning it. I had become more than an artist. I had become a marketer, community builder, mentor, and educator. And eventually, I realized that the lessons I had learned were not only useful for musicians, they could help anyone trying to rebuild their life and create a new direction. Part 5. Why I created Echoes of the Future. I created Echoes of the Future because I know what it feels like to have no roadmap. I know what it feels like to be alone, overwhelmed, and unsure of what step to take next. I know what it feels like to rebuild your life from the ground up while carrying experiences that other people may not fully understand. Echoes of the Future is not only about music, social media, or digital marketing. Those are important tools, but they are only part of the journey. The real purpose is to support the person behind the dream. This space is for artists and creators, but it is also for the single mother beginning again, the person recovering from a relationship, the person whose career has changed, and anyone who feels as though life has placed them in unfamiliar territory. You may have a dream, but no strategy. You may have talent, but no confidence. You may know that you want something different, but have no idea where to begin. I created Echoes of the Future to help people begin where they are. My teaching comes from lived experience, self-education, formal study, creativity, recovery, business, mistakes, collaboration, and real industry challenges. I am not here because my journey was perfect. I am here because I kept learning. I learned how to use music as a source of strength. I learned how to use writing and affirmations to give my mind direction. I learned how education could help me understand myself. I learned that networking is about relationships and contribution. I learned that setbacks can become lessons, and lessons can become something that helps another person. Most importantly, I learned that rebuilding is possible. You do not need to have every answer today. You simply need to become honest about who you are, what you desire, and what your next step could be. That is the heart of Echoes of the Future. It is a place to create, inspire, teach, empower, and make an impact. My hope is that somewhere in my story, you recognize a part of your own. Your circumstances may be different, but perhaps you understand what it feels like to begin again. Your past is part of your story, but it does not have to become the limit of your future. You can learn, you can create a plan, you can take one step followed by another, and you do not have to do it alone. Welcome to Echoes of the Future.